Okay, yeah, so I'm Thomas Bodey from the University of Exeter, but much like Christian, this is not work that I can do all by myself. So there's a lot of other people who've helped do this work, and they come from a range of institutions, which are all up there. And again, probably like Christian, I'm not going to point at things because I don't know which one to point at. So I'm going to take you to the marine environment now, and just been in the wetlands, now we're going to go out to sea. And I'm going to think about essentially human-induced changes in the marine environment, of which there are, of course, many and varied causes. And I've tried to distill them all into 4 pictures. So we've got what humans take out of the sea, which I've covered with the fishing and any other exploitation, corals, sponges, you name it. Got invasive species. They've been added to pretty much every water body in the world, and they cause a lot of problems. The lionfish in the Caribbean is just one example. It's an introduced predator, much like the signal crayfish, and the native fish don't react to it, so it has a very nice time. We've got what we put into the sea, which we possibly shouldn't, so that's oil, plastics, runoff, everything else that we do. And the bottom left here, we've got climate change, ocean acidification, which of course is most obviously seen on coral reefs. And I work with seabirds quite a bit, and some of these impacts are really obvious on seabirds. You know, you don't even need me to really show you a picture of an oiled seabird, or this is an albatross chick which has been fed a large amount of plastic. Invasive species can of course be on islands out at sea where they can have devastating consequences. This is one mink cache, so of terns, I think it's Arctic terns, so they can be a big problem. And some of them can be more subtle. So this last one, the bottom corner there, is a count of Adelie penguin colony. And essentially, as the climate has warmed around Antarctica, the number of Adelie penguins has gone down because actually Adelie penguins really like it cold. So they've been moving, and so the colony has changed. But today I'm basically going to think about fisheries, both in terms of what they take out and then what they put back, particularly through the policy of discarding, which certainly in the EU is a hot topic at the moment because there are proposals to change the way this is done. Currently, I actually should have looked up the figure, I realised just a couple of minutes ago, but it's an awful lot of tons of fish are simply chucked back into the sea, wasted by humans, but they're a valuable resource if you can exploit them. And I'm also just going to touch on a bit about the fact that different fish species, of course, also respond to climate and have been moving and changing their distributions. So we think of these things as being a bad thing. We're removing fish, we're polluting the sea, we're trashing everything. But in fact, there are quite a few studies suggesting that for marine vertebrates, both birds and mammals, there are winners and losers, and it's quite close to a 50-50 split. And this is for species with varying degrees of winning. It's been shown around Europe that both great skuas, top left, and herring gulls, top right, have actually increased their populations. Overwinter survival is enhanced by this new availability of discards, or in the case of herring gulls, also other waste, which they're now able to exploit and eat, and so their adult survival has increased. Cape gannets, bottom right, their populations where the fish stocks have declined actually within their areas, but adult survival has been maintained largely through discards. However, they have a win and loss because actually their reproductive effort and reproductive success has dramatically declined where they feed on a lot of discards. And in the bottom left, we have the Amsterdam albatross. I assume most of you know that albatrosses are particularly badly affected by longline fisheries. This is the most endangered albatross in the world, and its population, the adult survival, is catastrophically affected by fishing, but climate change and warming of the Indian Ocean has actually massively enhanced overwinter survival of adults, so that these two things are currently balancing out and the population is remaining stable. So this would suggest there is good behavioural plasticity in these populations, in these species. They're able to exploit these novel resources, they're able to move to new areas, and so clearly they have a good ability to adapt to the changes that humans are creating in their environment. But actually almost all these studies are done at the population level, And that's not surprising because seabird colonies are just awesome places to go. They're spectacular, they're really in your face, and unsurprisingly, people want to study them. But of course, adaptation is not a population level process, it's an individual level process that scales up to the population. So just simply collecting population data may be an oversimplification of what is going on. No offense, Christian. But you have individual data too. So, and this, just to bang home that point, there are 3 measurable population types. So, and this is why the conflict can happen. If individuals in whatever response you measure are fairly general, then the population looks general and so they match. And same, if individuals specialize on one particular way of doing something or one particular thing to eat, then the population will look the same. But the mismatch occurs when different individuals have different responses, but at the population level, if you look at it like that, it will appear generalist, but actually it's made up of a range of specialists. So that's where the potential interesting differences can occur. And actually seabirds are quite prone, if you want to think of it as being prone to individual specialization and having different responses to different environmental traits. They're looking it's very difficult for us. We often think that the marine environment is quite homogeneous, it's the sea. But of course, to an individual that lives there, it's a very varied place with as many habitats as there are on terrestrial systems. So it's patchy, it's ephemeral, but at large scales it's often quite predictable the kind of general area you should go if you want to eat a particular prey item. But different prey will of course occupy different habitats and be triggered by different environmental cues on the surface. So for example, the extent of primary productivity, where the wave fronts are, where the particular upwellings are, all those things are going to give you different prey and different possibilities of resource capture. And often those species are actually going to require a different technique. Should you chase after them? Should you look for them in a cave? And these are just 4 of the species which has been shown that dietary specialization occurs within seabirds. They're also long-lived relative to most other birds. 20, 30, 40 years is perfectly normal lifespan for a seabird. And they move over vast distances. But in their breeding season, almost all of them are central place foragers, so they can become very familiar with a small patch. And it's this combination probably of patchiness, some degree of predictability, yet an ephemeral food resource, and this range of prey types they can take, which probably helps generate these specializations. And of course that affects a whole range of things. Ecologically affects the way you would examine resource partitioning, for example, or how they're using their niche. Or clearly it's the basis of evolution. That variation is what enables the species to evolve. And if we're thinking in terms of conservation, it can be very important in terms of, well, what can they eat? What do they eat? What could they eat in the future? Where can they go? Can they move place? If we change somewhere, will that affect the way that individuals can respond? And so I'm going to think about specialization in terms of repeatability, just how consistent an individual is. And essentially, this is 2 graphs I pinched from a nice paper from Dan Bolnick. And the thick black line is the population. And so if the individuals are generalist, they have a wide range of responses along whatever this x-axis resource use is, whether it's where you go, what you eat, how often you breed. And so the variation between individuals is actually quite small because each individual spans a wide range. Whereas if they're specializing, of course, you get the reverse, and each individual occupies a very small part of that population niche. And so there's good separation between individuals. And I'm not going to talk about this in terms of personality or anything, but this is the kind of thing people consider behavioral syndromes if these specializations persist. So I'm going to think of them more as ecomorphs. And I'm going to consider them in terms of 2 key ecological parameters, which is where they move and what they eat. And we've been using the northern gannet, which is a very charismatic seabird, in my opinion. It's the largest European seabird. Males and females pretty much look identical, and they're capable of going very long distances. While they're breeding, 200 kilometers is perfectly standard, less than a day trip to go and get some food. 500 kilometers, perfectly normal. 800 kilometers, getting towards the extreme end of what they're going to be doing while successfully breeding. And they're capable of taking pretty much any kind of prey, from very small, young-of-year sand eels through pelagic fish, and they're also quite happy to take stuff off the back of fishing boats. And all the colonies we've been visiting, and indeed most of the colonies in Europe are still increasing in size. So this is a bird that appears to be doing quite well. And because they're large, we can just buy off the shelf at any nice electronic store GPSs, and we can stick them on their tails and follow where they go during the breeding season. And because we catch them to put them on and take them off, we can take a blood sample, and we can use this to look at the stable isotopic data within their blood, which I'll just go into in a minute, and we can see what they've been eating. And we can also put a geolocator on, which gives us less accurate information, but gives us the broad area they go in the winter, because they move away from their breeding colonies. So I don't know how many people are familiar with stable isotopes, so I put just a tiny bit in here. Forgive me if I bore you. So essentially you are what you eat, so everything you eat goes into your tissues. And we use the blood, we separate it into plasma, which turns over in about a week. So that gives us an idea of the average food consumption during the last week. And we use the red blood cells, which turn over in about a month, to look at a longer term average of what they've been eating. And we're interested in the nitrogen content and the carbon content of these isotopes. And for the purposes of this, we're using nitrogen to separate benthic fish, which is essentially stuff gannets cannot get for themselves, and pelagic fish, which is stuff they can get for themselves. And on the carbon axis, we essentially have an offshore-inshore gradient. We can put different fish species, we can get samples, we can see where they fit into this isotopic space. And basically we have stuff that's scavenged, it's benthic and appears at the top and separates out nicely from stuff they've been eating themselves, such as mackerel, which would be forage fish and appears at a much lower nitrogen and offshore carbon gradient. We add birds to that space, so these 4 birds represent potential birds. And we see, say, for example, the one really near the mackerel, we use a mixing model process, which I'm not obviously going to bore you with, and that will come out that that one eats a lot of mackerel, the higher ones will eat more whitefish, and it can give you estimates of the proportions. And we also, there's a nice paper just come out this year, we've basically put cameras on their back instead of GPSs, and we can film them, and this kind of proves that they do go to fishing boats, because here's one filming its friends, all waiting behind a boat for the discards to come. In fact, we now have video of them also following each other and queuing in on fishing boats. We've been at colonies around Ireland, which vary in size quite dramatically, by orders of magnitude. It's basically every gannet in the area, and they go out into the Irish and Celtic seas. So I'm interested in the dietary variation. Are individuals specialised? Are these anthropogenic food sources? The discard's important. And are there any consequences for actually having a different specialisation? Does it really matter, or are they all just different strategies to the same end? And we're going to look at that in terms of the body condition of the birds. So this plot is a plot of 25 individuals from one colony, and it's the estimated proportion, based on the isotopic information, of scavenged whitefish in their diet. And the red line represents the modal estimate for that colony. So we can see that there are some individuals that are clearly taking far more than the population average mode, and there are some individuals taking far less. And this pattern is repeated if we look at another forage fish they could take, such as mackerel. We again see that there are some degrees of specialisation within this population, and this pattern repeats to varying extents in all the study populations. So then we can say, does this matter? And here we have the scaled mass, so we're on the y-axis, so we're correcting for the fact that different birds are slightly different sizes, and we're looking at the percentage of forage fish that they've been consuming in their diet. And we see that, yes, there is a point in eating more of the kind of forage fish, the stuff they have evolved to eat. It differs whether you're male or female, but in both cases, the more you eat of the main forage fish, the better your body condition. So it's a good idea to eat what you're designed to eat as a gannet. Thank you for that stunning revelation. How about if we look at scavenged fish? Well, this is the discards on the x-axis instead now, and we see that consuming more discards is not obviously having the same effect. It's not increasing your body condition. It's dependent on your sex as to whether it's a poor strategy, it's going down for females, and this is actually neutral for males. That's why I've put a question mark by it, because there is actually evidence that from Cape gannets, a different species that, as I mentioned at the beginning, it may maintain your body condition, but it actually doesn't really help your chick, so it's probably not a particularly positive strategy. So there's evidence for some specialization and consistency because, as I didn't actually mention that, but because we have these 4 measures, we can look at it over time, and individuals are repeatable in which fish they're preferring. So there's consistency of prey type consumption, and all strategies are not producing equal energetic rewards. It's not helping you maintain your body condition. We also have some evidence that it appears that actually individuals are unable to escape their condition-related phenotype, and by this I mean that if you're in poor condition one year, you're in poor condition the next year, and you don't seem to be able to get out of this circle, and if you're in good condition, you stay in good condition. So it may be that these discards are in fact enabling some low-quality birds that are in poor condition to persist. We're still working on trying to answer that question, but this is the graph, so body condition is really quite repeatable from one year to the next. So maybe they don't have much ability to change their condition no matter how they're eating, or maybe they don't have the ability to switch strategy and therefore are unable to change their condition. But we're also interested in where they go. So obviously you can eat the same thing and you can always go to the same place to get it. You can always go to the same cafe for your coffee. But maybe you fancy a change and you just go to different places, and maybe you have a coffee one day but you have McDonald's the next day. So we want to know why they would be repeatable. And we want to know if there are consequences, and here I'm thinking about how each of these individual movements is going to scale up to a population level result and a response. And this is just to show you an example of a bird that is and a bird that isn't repeatable. So this is Great Salty, a small colony off Ireland, and here's first trip, second trip, you get the picture. The bird always heads out in a southwesterly direction to varying distances, but pretty much the same route, so it's quite a repeatable bird. Same colony, different bird, doesn't know where it wants to go each time, changes its mind, obviously explores a much greater area and is far less consistent in what is going on. So don't worry about all the numbers on this table, but what I want you to take away from it is that most of them are in bold, and that means that they are significantly repeatable. And that's in terms of how long the birds go away for, how far away they bother to get from the colony, which doesn't have to be directly related because they can have a more or less tortuous path, and also the angle in which they tend to head out. They've got a range of options, and this is not directly from the colony. This is 5 kilometers out where they will have actually got away from any colony level effects. And these are all significantly repeatable. So clearly individuals don't explore their whole area. And this kind of crazy pictures are reaction norms. And these are responses of individuals at one colony to various environmental covariates that we can measure, such as the amount of zooplankton, which is a kind of proxy for where the fish might be, because the fish are eating that, the primary productivity of the area in the middle, and the sea surface temperature. And essentially what I want you to take away from this is that those lines are very different for each individual. There are clearly completely different responses to environmental covariates for each of the individuals. And this is strong individual differences in both the gradient, the way they respond, and in how they respond, even the direction of the slope, which suggests that individuals maybe are repeatable in the trip metrics that they're doing because they're going to seek specific areas, but that differs by individual. And so different individuals are looking for something related to a specific environmental condition. And 55% of this data is simply explained by who are you. We can also look at this movement in the winter. So gannets leave the UK or Norway or wherever they happen to be during their breeding season, and they move south for the winter very sensibly. Although some of them, as you'll see from this graph, this is the kind of kernel density for December. Some of them hang around the UK, some of them come to France or Spain. Actually, some of them go to the Mediterranean, so there's my link to the conference title. And most of them go to West Africa, and they hang around off the upwelling there. But we can look at how repeatable year on year individuals are in what they do and where they go. And this is the latitude and the longitude of the centroid of their winter distribution, and then the range size of it too. And we can see that individuals are extremely repeatable, essentially, in where they go, given that they have most of that map to pick from. That sort of degree of repeatability is really quite strong. So clearly, doing what you did before is how they respond. So individuals are often strongly repeatable during the breeding season in where they're going when they're foraging for their young. They're highly repeatable in where they go during the wintering season when they're not breeding. And this actually means that any individual has probably quite a limited idea of what's going on within what we may think of as the homogeneous marine environment. And they're essentially sticking with what they know. And that's a very sensible strategy. There's really good theoretical evidence that doing what you did before is clearly, you're still alive, so it works, so do it again. And equally, if you're a youngster and you're not sure what you should do what they're doing because they're still alive, so clearly this is a strategy that works. So we've expanded that up to actually a large number of the colonies around the UK. And we've got to show this is contiguous tracking data from the same year for all these colonies. And we can see that those repeatable individual movements have actually led to colony-level separation. And I should add here that gannets are not territorial in any way. They are of their little space around the nest site, but not of once they're out at sea. They follow each other, they queue in on each other. So the fact that there's separation shows that they really are repeatable, and these repeatable effects of different colonies are pulling out these separations. I don't have time to explain all of the ins and outs of that, but you can ask me afterwards. If we zoom into Ireland, remember at the beginning I said 200 kilometres is easy, normal for a gannet. All of those colonies are within 200 kilometres of each other. So there's no reason that clearly what is a good fishing ground sustaining a large population at one colony should not be exploited necessarily by individuals from another one. And yet it doesn't really happen at all. The degree of overlap is astonishingly low. On the west coast of Ireland, those colonies are 20 kilometres apart. You can see each other, one from the other, and yet overlap is 20%. And they're constrained by the energetics, they're constrained by the competition between intraspecific competition, and that goes within and across colonies, and they're constrained by the way in which information is transferred between colony members. That's the details I don't have to go into. But it suggests there will be cultural differences between these colonies. So nearby food resources that would be useful are actually unknown. In that way, I want to think about the speed and the constraints on change. And part of a sentence in the entry stuff for this conference was that rapid dispersal to more benign conditions is a way in which organisms can cope with climate change. And sure, but is it possible in all species? And I want to think of this in terms of adaptation to prey movement. So things like mackerel are moving further north, and yet birds at a colony are quite stuck in what they do. And they do this, I haven't shown you, but they do this year on year. So they're very repeatable, and the same individuals do the same thing. They have some ability to adjust, but it's nowhere near as much as the prey shifts. So we're going to get a mismatch, but we don't know what's going to happen. This is it was alluded to by Christian, work from White and Woods on great tits. This is without phenotypic plasticity. They modeled the extinction risk, and essentially red is a high risk of extinction. And what you've got is reproductive output on the y-axis and generation time on the x-axis. And seabirds are obviously right out in the bottom right-hand corner. They have low reproductive output and long generation times. So they need an extreme amount of plasticity if they're going to respond. And we simply don't know what that will be. And if anyone has some brilliant ideas about how to measure plasticity and genetic components of that in such a long-lived bird, I would love to hear from you. So, is rapid dispersal possible? Probably not, because they've got to find another island colony, and individuals are incredibly highly philopatric. So, if you're breeding at a colony, it's almost certain that you were born at that colony. Juveniles have more than 95% return rates to their own colony. And this, again, fits in with that, do what you know, and it will see you through. So large-scale movement of breeding individuals is probably not going to happen at all. And of juveniles, it's unlikely. So maybe new colony formation will occur, but it will be slow, very slow, over periods of maybe 100 years. And it will be dependent on suitability of northern locations, for example, suitable islands to be present for them to do. So actually this adaptation may be required in situ, and they're not maybe able to move. I think I've shown you that some individuals have the capacity to exploit new and varied resources that humans are adding to their environment. So there are winners and losers actually within the species, not just winning and losing species. And this is probably because the population has generalists and specialists. And there's a nice paper which I've forgotten to reference in here from 2009, looking at over 20 years worth of guillemot breeding data, which suggests that actually over that period of time, generalists and specialists have had much the same reproductive success, but that this is starting to break down in the last few years, as they've had catastrophic failures, particularly of the specialists. In fisheries, it's been suggested previously by David Gremillet et al. That they may be an ecological trap because they provide an easy resource. The illusion is that it's junk food. It's like going for McDonald's every single day. It's not good for you. But it's easy, and so individuals can do it and they can sustain themselves. But I think it may also be a conservation trap. So in the UK, we love our birds and we're very keen on counting them a lot and looking at how well they're doing. So people are pleased that there are lots of gannets. But actually, if quite a few of them are being sustained by a speciality of picking up on fisheries resources, and the EU is going to change fisheries resources, and for many good reasons, then we may actually have more birds than we can actually sustain under the current circumstances. And removal may have unforeseen consequences. For gannets, it probably means that they'll die or they'll have to move somewhere else, which we're not quite sure how they'll do. For another bird, the great skewer, it just means they go and eat all the other seabirds, which is probably not a great thing either. But I think in terms of, we think of those, the way that colonies constrain each other, this has impacts beyond seabirds and for other, particularly colonial species, because humans are manipulating the environment all the time in all sorts of places. We're taking stuff out, we're changing habitats, we're restructuring things. In the sea, we're going to be sticking in a lot of alternative energy installations. And the way all these things are assessed currently is that any population that can reach this area will be affected. And so therefore the load is spread across them and it makes everyone feel better. But actually this constraint of neighbours and neighbouring colonies probably means that impacts are not going to be equally spread across colonies, and actually some are going to be much more severely affected than others. And this may hold true for a range of species. So I'd like to thank a bunch of people, because catching gannets is not something I advise you to do alone. So these people have all been out there and helped me do that. NERC funded our research, and there's a whole bunch of organisations that own the islands, and we also couldn't have gone there and done this work if they hadn't let us. Thanks very much for your attention and the invitation.